All right, so today we're going to deep dive into biodiversity. You know, how we usually measure it.
Yeah, counting species, right. More is better.
Right, like it's some kind of contest. But hold on, because this group, ArcheWild, they do ecological restoration. They're like, whoa, hold up.
Challenging the status quo.
Totally. In their white paper, it's almost like they're saying that's not the whole story.
Yeah, like just counting misses the point. It's like each species, it does something, right? It's
yes.
got a role to play in the whole system.
Exactly. Like just knowing how many different kinds there are, that's not enough.
Yeah, there's all these ways to count, right? Like species richness, that's just the number.
Yeah.
Then you got weighted biodiversity.
Which is?
Tries to figure out like how common or rare each one is. And it gets even more complicated. Special biodiversity, genetic biodiversity, and ecological biodiversity. They all look at different things.
And it's interesting because even with all these fancy ways to count, ArcheWild is saying that doesn't tell you how well the ecosystem is actually working.
Right. And that matters for investors, big time. Because you could, like, put money into a project and it looks awesome on paper, tons of species. But if it's not sustainable, you're in trouble.
Right, it's all going to fall apart.
Like a house of cards or like inflating stock prices. Looks good for a bit, then boom, reality hits.
Ouch. So what's the alternative? What do these ArcheWild folks suggest?
Instead of asking how many, they ask how close.
Okay, how close to what?
To the carrying capacity. Like how much life can that ecosystem actually handle?
I think we got to explain carrying capacity for our listeners. It's not like we talk about that at the dinner table every night.
Right, so it's basically the maximum number of individuals, like of a species, that a place can support.
Support how?
Sustainably. It's all about resources, right? And competition, predation, even things like diseases and disasters.
So every spot's got its own limit, right? Not too much, not too little.
Like a Goldilocks zone for biodiversity.
Love that. And what I like about this how close thing is it's not just about adding more and more species.
Yeah, it's about creating a system that actually works, that's resilient.
Like you're not just randomly throwing plants in there, you're choosing them carefully.
Yeah, the ones that belong that make the whole thing healthier. And ArcheWild, they go even further. They say, hey, use local plants with diverse genetics.
Local plants, got it. But diverse genetics, what's that all about?
Okay, so picture this. Red maple trees. There's actually 3 different kinds in North America, right?
Like red maples are red maples, right?
Well, yeah, but each one's adapted to a slightly different environment. So you plant the wrong one, it might look like you're boosting biodiversity, but you're actually messing things up.
Whoa, so even within the same species, there's like a right choice and a wrong choice.
Exactly, like the right tool for the job. You wouldn't use a hammer to screw in a light bulb, right?
Definitely not. So this is huge for like nurseries and the plant industry, right?
Yeah, imagine if they started offering like specific plants from your region labeled with their genetics.
Wow, that's a whole different level of thinking about plants. So back to investors, right? They're putting money into this stuff. Why should they care about how close?
Because it helps them make smarter choices. Instead of being fooled by big numbers, they can look at how well the project's restoring the whole system.
So it's about long-term value, not just a quick fix.
Exactly, like real ecological health, not just appearances.
It's like seeing through the marketing hype and getting to the real deal.
Right, it's bringing real honesty and ecological integrity to like the whole world of restoration finance.
Okay, so we've got the how close concept. Now I'm curious, how does ArcheWild actually do this in the real world? They got any examples, like case studies or something?
Oh yeah, tons. And they're working in all sorts of different ecosystems too. They've got projects everywhere, like restoring prairies in the Midwest, fixing up coastal dunes on the East Coast. And ArcheWild, they're working on restoring this one type of dry forest. It's been hammered by invasives.
So how's this how close idea working there?
Well, first they had to figure out what the original plant community was like before all the invasives moved in.
Like going way back.
Yeah, looking at historical records and stuff. Then comes the hard part, getting rid of those invasives and bringing back the natives that disappeared.
I bet that's not easy.
And they're not just planting anything, they're getting seeds and plants from nearby areas so the genetics match up.
So it's like super specific.
Exactly. The right plant for the right spot, like ecological matchmaking.
That's pretty wild. And are they seeing results? Is this how close the thing actually making a difference?
Yeah, they are. Native plants are starting to come back, and with them you get the insects, the birds, the whole gang.
So it's like a chain reaction.
Exactly. It's a slow process, but things are definitely moving in the right direction.
That's awesome. It shows this approach can work. And speaking of, like, the bigger picture, we got to talk about the global biodiversity crisis, right? We're losing species like crazy. It can feel pretty overwhelming.
It's a big problem, for sure.
So how close thinking fit in with all that? It seems very local.
Well, it is local, but it can make a difference globally, too.
How so?
Think of it like this. Each local ecosystem, it's like a thread in a giant tapestry. And when you restore one, you're making that whole tapestry stronger.
I like that. So, like, a bunch of local projects can actually have a global impact.
Right. And if this how close thinking starts influencing, like, policies and stuff, it could really change how we do conservation on a large scale.
Instead of just focusing on protected areas, we're thinking about the whole landscape.
Yeah, like designing cities with green spaces that actually mimic nature, or like making agriculture more wildlife friendly, even thinking about infrastructure projects in a new way.
It's a different way of thinking about our relationship with nature.
Less about control, more about working together.
And I think that's the really hopeful thing about this how close approach.
Definitely. It's not just about fixing what we broke. It's about creating a future where humans and nature can both thrive.
Love it. Okay, so we've talked about the why and the how of this whole thing. But what about our listeners? What can they actually do? I bet they're thinking, this is all cool, but how do I apply this to my own yard, my community?
That's a great question. And I think the first step is like a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing your yard as just your yard, you got to think of it as part of a bigger ecosystem.
So zoom out a little bit, right? See the bigger picture.
Exactly. And then you can start asking those how close questions. Like, what kind of ecosystem am I actually in? What plants and animals belong here?
And then what?
Then you figure out how to create a space that supports those species.
It's like turning your yard into a little mini nature preserve. But what if you don't have a yard?
There's still tons you can do. You can volunteer with a conservation group or, support those nurseries that are growing native plants.
Right, those super specific ones we talked about.
Exactly. Or even just spread the word about this how close idea. Tell your friends, your family.
Because even small changes can add up, right? It all contributes to making our communities and the whole planet a little bit better for biodiversity. Okay,
Yeah.
So ArcheWild's How Close? It's a total game changer for how we think about biodiversity. But honestly, is it all a bit too good to be true? Like, are there downsides, challenges we haven't thought of?
Totally fair question. And ArcheWild, they're not pretending it's all simple. Like, figuring out carrying capacity, it's not exactly easy.
Yeah, no kidding. Seems like a lot goes into it.
Oh, tons. It changes all the time, right? Weather, resources, what species are there, it's all connected.
So how do you even measure something that complicated?
It's got to be a multi-pronged approach. ArcheWild says you got to combine the science with what you see on the ground, even what people remember from the past.
So like soil samples, but also talking to old-timers who've seen the place change over time.
Exactly. And that's where working together is key. ArcheWild says you need ecologists, the people actually doing the restoration, and the folks who live there. Everyone sees things a little differently.
Makes sense. It's not just about the numbers, it's about understanding that specific place.
Right. And that's especially important when you're dealing with places humans messed up,
Yeah.
Development, invasives, that kind of stuff. Figuring out the original carrying capacity, that can be tough.
Yeah, like rewinding the clock. Right?
Totally. And that's where the experts come in. Ecologists, restoration folks, they use all their knowledge to make good choices. What to plant, where, how to take care of it.
So it's like art meets science, right?
Yeah.
Intuition and data.
Yeah. And it's always changing, right, as we learn more. But even with all that, ArcheWild's convinced this how close thing, it's still the best way to measure if we're actually making progress.
Because it's not just about a snapshot in time, right? It's about the whole system working long term.
Exactly. And that's what sustainability really means, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about a quick win, it's about ecosystems that can handle whatever's thrown at them.
Like building a house with a strong foundation, not just painting the walls.
Perfect analogy. And think about climate change. Everything's getting more unpredictable. We need ecosystems that can roll with the punches.
So this how close idea, it's not just about the past, it's about being ready for the future.
Right. That's why it's so important to have lots of different kinds of life, not just the pretty ones. A diverse ecosystem, it's like having a bunch of different investments. If one fails, you're not wiped out.
Makes sense. It's about building a safety net, right?
Exactly. A web of life that's strong and flexible. And honestly, that's a really hopeful message. With all the bad news about biodiversity, it gives us a way forward.
Totally agree. ArcheWild's How Close? It's a way to measure, to guide our actions, to build a better future.
And it reminds us we're all part of this. What we do matters.
Whether it's in our own backyards or somewhere wild.
So next time you're out in nature, take a minute. Look around.
And think, how can I help this place get closer to its full potential? Because even small things, when lots of people do them, can make a huge difference.
That's the kind of impact that lasts.